Today we are going to explore one of the most misunderstood episodes in human history, the real condition of women in medieval Europe, a world far more complex and surprising than textbooks usually reveal. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is an image that stubbornly repeats itself in the popular imagination, an image built over centuries of mistaken interpretations, convenient simplifications, and often a worldview retroactively projected onto the past. In this image, the medieval woman always appears in the background, submissive, silent, confined within the walls of a castle or a convent, voiceless, propertyless, without choice, a decorative figure in a world ruled exclusively by men. But what happens when historians decide to look beyond the myths? What do the actual documents from the period reveal? The notarial records, commercial contracts, personal letters, court transcripts, and legal codes that have survived the centuries? The answer almost invariably is surprising, and this surprise is no small thing. The European Middle Ages span approximately 1,000 years of history, from the 5th to the 15th century. It is such a vast period, so geographically diverse and culturally heterogeneous, that reducing it to a single narrative would be, at the very least, a historical inaccuracy. And yet that is precisely what happened for a long time. Schooling, cinema, and popular literature treated this millennium as a monolithic block of darkness and oppression, where little light entered and even less escaped. The truth, as almost always happens with real history, is infinitely richer and more unsettling to our preconceptions. To understand it, one must first abandon the temptation to apply present-day criteria to the past. It is not about romanticizing an era that undoubtedly had its own forms of injustice. It is about understanding that era on its own terms, with the tools it itself left us. And what those tools reveal is disconcerting. In many regions of medieval Europe, women could own land, inherit property, manage businesses, sign contracts, sue commercial rivals in court, and, in certain contexts, exercise political authority directly and with legal recognition. These were not rare exceptions reserved for queens and high-ranking nobles. They were documented realities across much broader layers of society. But how was this possible in an era that common sense describes as dominated by the most absolute patriarchy? The answer lies in factors that rarely appear in history classes: the economic structures of the period, the role of religious institutions, and the practical needs of daily life in an agrarian society. Feudalism created situations in which women were, in practice, the only viable managers of a fief. When the lord departed for war or on a crusade, his wife or daughter took over, not out of generous concession, but out of the system's structural necessity. In taking charge, they exercised powers that, in modern terms, we would unhesitatingly call political and economic. The English records of the 12th and 13th centuries are filled with women acting as estate administrators, conducting negotiations with tenants, deciding on harvests and taxes, and receiving oaths of loyalty. Not as temporary substitutes, but as full agents whose decisions carried legal weight and real consequences. There is an even more revealing aspect that emerges when historians delve into the archives of medieval guilds, associations of workers and artisans that regulated trade in European cities. What these documents show flatly contradicts the narrative of the medieval woman as someone excluded from economic life. In cities like Paris, Cologne, and London, women not only participated in guilds, they founded their own. There were exclusively female guilds dedicated to weaving, silk, and the making of high-value garments. These women traded, exported, employed others, and accumulated wealth independently. When contracts were broken or rights violated, they turned to the courts, and the courts listened to them. It was not perfect. It was not egalitarian in terms we would recognize today, but it was very different from the absolute silence we were taught. The question beginning to take shape is not merely historical, it is also about ourselves. Why was this history buried? Why did the dominant narrative prefer for so long the image of the oppressed and invisible medieval woman when the documents of the era themselves told something very different? The answer requires following the path that historians have followed, document by document, city by city, century by century. That is precisely the path we will walk together. To understand where medieval women had more power than the popular narrative suggests, we must start with a place few associate with female freedom: the courts. The dusty corridors of medieval legal systems hold in their records some of the most compelling evidence of a reality that contradicts the myth of the woman completely invisible before the law. In 13th century England, there existed a legal concept whose mere existence is already revealing: the femme sole. The term, derived from the Norman French that then dominated official English documents, designated a woman who operated commercially on her own, with her own legal personality. In practical terms, this meant she could sign contracts, initiate lawsuits, and be sued in her own name, without the need for a tutor or spouse as a legal intermediary. What makes this legal institution especially significant is that it was not restricted to widows or unmarried women, categories one would expect to find with greater autonomy. The femme sole also applied to married women when they practiced a trade or commerce independently of their husbands. In other words, medieval English law recognized that a woman could, at the same time, be a wife and an autonomous economic agent. These were spheres that could coexist. The records of London's courts reveal dozens of cases in which married women appeared as litigants in commercial disputes, defending contracts, claiming debts, and answering for obligations. These were not exceptional cases that reached the courts because they were legal curiosities. They were everyday transactions of an urban economic life in which women actively participated. At this point, an inevitable question begins to emerge. If this legal recognition existed, why did it disappear? Why, centuries later, during the so-called early modern period, did European law move toward an even greater restriction of female autonomy rather than the opposite direction? The answer touches on one of the most fascinating paradoxes of Western history. In certain central respects, women of later centuries ended up having less legal and economic freedom than their medieval predecessors. What we often call linear progress toward equality is in reality a far more complex trajectory, with advances, retreats, and contradictions that defy any simplistic reading. But secular law was only one of the structures that shaped the lives of medieval women. There was another, even more omnipresent and, surprisingly, even more ambiguous: the Catholic Church. The relationship between the Church and women in the Middle Ages is often described as one of unequivocal oppression, and there is no doubt that ecclesiastical doctrine contained elements that limited the female role in the public and spiritual spheres. Women could not be priests, they could not preach officially. They were often described by theologians as beings more prone to temptation and error. And yet, within this same institution that excluded them from certain roles, women found spaces of power, intellect, and influence that simply did not exist in any other structure of the time. Medieval convents were, in many ways, the only institutions of the period in which a woman could ascend to a recognized position of leadership, manage extensive properties, oversee communities, handle finances, and exercise authority over others. The abbess of a monastery could control larger territories than many lower-ranking nobles, negotiate with bishops and kings, and make decisions affecting hundreds of lives. More than that, the convent was often the only place where a medieval woman had guaranteed access to education. In an era when literacy was rare even among noblemen, nuns learned to read and write in Latin, studied theology and philosophy, and copied and preserved manuscripts. Some went further and produced original works of lasting impact. Hildegard of Bingen, born in 1098 in the region of what is now Germany, is perhaps the most cited example, but she is far from the only one. A composer, writer, naturalist, visionary, and regular correspondent with popes and emperors, Hildegard built an influence that transcended the walls of the convent and the boundaries of her time. She was not an isolated exception who flourished despite the system. She was the most visible product of a female intellectual tradition that monastic life made possible. And this tradition, as we shall see, encompassed far more than one might imagine. The intellectual tradition that medieval convents made possible was not, as is sometimes assumed, a phenomenon restricted to one or two exceptional figures. It was a living and branching network that spanned Christian Europe, connecting women who, outside the monastery walls, would never have had access to the world of letters, philosophy, or the natural sciences. Hildegard of Bingen was not alone. A few centuries before her, in the heart of medieval Europe, an abbess named Herad of Hohenberg had compiled one of the most ambitious illustrated encyclopedias of the 12th century. The Hortus Deliciarum, or Garden of Delights, was a monumental work, a collection of texts on theology, philosophy, natural history, and astronomy, richly illustrated and organized with a clearly pedagogical intent. Herad did not merely compile it. She conceived it as a teaching tool for the young nuns under her guidance. The existence of these works raises a question that historians have explored with growing interest. What would the medieval world have lost and preserved if women had not found in convents a space, however limited, for intellectual production? But the scope of medieval female protagonism was not limited to the cloister walls. There was another domain, equally unexpected, in which women exercised documented influence: medicine. The city of Salerno in southern Italy was, between the 10th and 13th centuries, the most advanced medical center in the Western world. There operated a school that attracted students and practitioners from all over Europe and the Arab world. And among the figures associated with this school, a name emerges that historiography debated for decades: Trotula. The texts known as the Trotula, a collection of treatises on women's health that circulated widely throughout medieval Europe, were for a long time attributed to a female physician named Trotula of Salerno. Whether she existed as a real person and direct author of these texts, or whether she was a partly legendary figure built around an earlier medical tradition, remains an open question among scholars. But what is not in dispute is the influence of the texts themselves. Copied, translated, and consulted for centuries, they represent a body of knowledge that was regarded as medical authority throughout Christian Europe. The simple fact that the medieval world produced, circulated, and took these texts seriously, with remarkable depth and precision, is in itself evidence that contradicts the image of an era that simply ignored or suppressed women's knowledge. And there was yet another field, radically different, in which women left documented traces: lyric poetry. In southern France, between the 12th and 13th centuries, one of the most sophisticated poetic traditions of the European Middle Ages flourished. The troubadours, poets who sang of courtly love, politics, and the customs of their time in the Occitan language, are widely known. What is far less remembered is that there were also women among them. The trobairits, as they were called, were poetesses who composed and often also performed their own works. They were noble, educated, and wrote about love, desire, jealousy, and loyalty with an unmistakable direct voice. The Countess of Deer, whose full name remains uncertain to history, is the most famous among them. Her verses have survived the centuries with a vitality that still impresses contemporary readers. She did not write about herself as a passive object of male admiration. She wrote as a subject, with desire and with agency. The existence of the trobairits is not a minor detail of medieval culture. It is a window into a society in which, at least in certain strata and contexts, the female voice did not have to be entirely suppressed in order to be tolerated. It was recognized, celebrated, and preserved. But there is something that unites Hildegard's convent, the medical school of Salerno, and the Occitan courts where the trobairits composed their verses. In all these cases, women were not merely occupying spaces that men had granted them out of generosity. They were responding to the real needs of their societies with competence, creativity, and authority, and those societies, to varying degrees, recognized that competence and depended on it. The most complex, and perhaps the most revealing terrain was yet to be explored, because up to this point, what we have seen are women operating in the interstices of the system, in the spaces that the medieval structure left open out of necessity or tradition. There were, however, women who went far beyond that, women who not only filled the gaps of male power, but who, at specific moments, shaped the course of European history in a direct and decisive way. It is toward this terrain that we now move forward. There are names that history has recorded with reverence, but whose true magnitude rarely reaches the classroom. Among them, perhaps none is more emblematic than that of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born around 1122, Eleanor inherited from her father, while still a teenager, control over Aquitaine, one of the richest and most extensive regions of medieval Europe. The inheritance was not symbolic, it was real territorial power, with vast domains, revenues, and feudal loyalties. She was, before any marriage, one of the most powerful figures of her time. Her subsequent life dismantled all the boundaries that common sense draws around medieval feminine possibilities. Queen of France upon marrying Louis VII, she accompanied her husband on the Second Crusade, a journey during which her political influence and willingness to intervene in decisions stirred equal measures of controversy and admiration. When the marriage was annulled, she managed her own interests with the efficiency of a consummate stateswoman. 2 months later, she married Henry II of England, becoming queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. When Henry died, she governed England as regent in the name of her son, Richard I. When Richard departed for the Crusades, it was she who administered the realm, negotiated agreements, warded off internal threats, and maintained the political stability of a territory that encompassed England and large portions of France. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived to the age of 80, during which time she continued to exercise direct influence over the destinies of children and grandchildren who were, in turn, the kings and queens of Europe. She was not an exceptional figure who emerged despite the system. She was the product of a system that, at least for women of a certain rank, permitted the exercise of political power in a direct and recognized manner. But Eleanor was not alone in this landscape. Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, waged one of the longest disputes for the throne in medieval English history. The period known as the Anarchy, which spanned much of the 1130s and 1140s, was marked by Matilda's struggle for the right to govern a kingdom her father had designated her as heir, but which the English barons, by and large, refused to accept under the command of a woman. What Matilda's story reveals is not the defeat of a woman before a system that rejected her. It reveals instead that there was an active debate over whether a woman could rule in her own name. This debate existed only because the possibility was real enough to be contested. Matilda was never crowned, but her son became Henry II. The royal lineage of England descends directly from a woman who fought for the throne with the means that the 12th century placed at her disposal. An even more direct example of effectively exercised political power is that of Blanche of Castile, Queen of France by marriage and regent by necessity. When her husband Louis VIII died in 1226, he left an heir 12 years of age. Blanche assumed the regency with a firmness that surprised barons, prelates, and neighboring kings who had hoped to exploit the fragility of a government headed by a woman. What they found was different. Blanche led France for nearly a decade as regent, suppressed noble revolts, negotiated treaties, managed finances, and prepared her son, whom history would know as Louis IX and the Church as St. Louis, for governance. Even after her son came of age, Blanche continued to be consulted and to influence the most important decisions of the realm. When Louis departed for the Seventh Crusade, it was once again Blanche who governed France in his absence. The pattern that emerges from these stories is not accidental. Throughout medieval Europe, the structures of dynastic power repeatedly created situations in which women assumed governance, and when they did, history records, in many cases, a competence that their contemporaries recognized and depended upon, even when they were reluctant to admit it openly. What these cases illuminate goes beyond individual biographies. They illuminate a structure, a system that, contrary to what we have been taught, did not systematically erase women from the exercise of power, but incorporated them into it out of necessity, by tradition, and sometimes simply because no other viable option existed. And when one begins to understand this structure, the question that inevitably emerges is another. What happened for all of this to change? Why did a system that incorporated women into power at so many levels and in so many ways give way in the following centuries to even stricter restrictions? The answer lies in a set of historical transformations that are rarely associated with the female condition, but which shaped it in a profound and lasting way. To answer why the spaces of power that medieval women occupied were progressively narrowed, one must look at historical movements that common sense rarely connects to the female condition, but which were decisive in shaping it. The first has a paradoxical name, the Renaissance of Roman law. From the 12th century onward, the emerging European universities, led by Bologna in Italy, began to rediscover and systematize the texts of classical Roman law, especially the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. It was a monumental body of laws that had governed the Roman Empire at its height, and that, in the view of medieval jurists, represented the highest point of legal rationality ever achieved by humanity. The problem, from the perspective of female autonomy, lay in what this law said. Classical Roman law was, in many respects, significantly more restrictive towards women than the customary law that had developed organically in medieval Europe. While local custom often recognized women's right to own property, trade, and litigate with considerable independence, Roman law placed married women under the tutelage of their husbands in a much more systematic and comprehensive way. As Roman law was adopted by European legal systems, first in the universities, then in royal and ecclesiastical courts, and finally in the emerging national legislations, it replaced and eroded the protections that local custom had guaranteed women. It was not an immediate process. It took centuries, but the trajectory was consistent. There is a profound irony in this process that historians have frequently underscored. It was precisely the intellectual movement that textbooks celebrate as an advance of rationality and European civilization that, in practice, stripped women of rights they possessed under a system considered less advanced. The second movement was even more structural: the rise of medieval universities and the systematic exclusion of women from them. The first European universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, emerged between the 11th and 13th centuries as institutions intended for the training of theologians, jurists, and physicians. They were male spaces not only by custom, but by institutional definition. Women could not attend them, could not obtain the degrees they conferred, and consequently could not officially practice the professions that those degrees qualified one for. The impact of this process was slow but profound. Medicine is the most revealing case. While empirical tradition allowed women to act as healers, midwives, and healing practitioners with recognized authority, progressive academic medicalization created a growing divide. On one side, physicians with university degrees, all men. On the other, traditional practices, progressively delegitimized and criminalized. The same process affected the crafts. As guilds became more formalized and regulated, and as economic pressure increased with the growth of cities and the emergence of more competitive markets, women were progressively excluded from positions they had once occupied with full recognition. Records show women contesting this exclusion in courts, invoking ancient customs and rights established over generations. But the trend was difficult to reverse, especially when new guild statutes began to be written with explicitly exclusionary language. There is yet a third factor that more recent historians have highlighted: the consolidation of nation-states and the growing need for clear rules of dynastic succession. In a world where kingdoms increasingly depended on professional armies and specialized bureaucracies, the figure of the regent or the sovereign heiress became, in the eyes of rising male elites, a political inconvenience to be systematically avoided. The result was a gradual and deliberate narrowing of the spaces in which female power had operated naturally for centuries. A narrowing that did not come from the depths of the Middle Ages, but, paradoxically, from the centuries that followed. Centuries that popular imagination associates with progress and light. It is here that history becomes more unsettling than any simplistic narrative would allow, because it was not the medieval darkness that restricted women most severely. It was, to a large extent, what came after that darkness. And understanding why this reversal was systematically erased from collective memory requires us to ask one final question, perhaps the most unsettling of all. Who had an interest in making us forget? The question seems provocative at first glance, but it is not. It is a legitimate historical question with a documented answer. The narrative of the medieval darkness, including that of the absolute erasure of women during this period, was to a large extent constructed by people living in later eras who had concrete reasons for wanting the past to seem darker than it had been. The starting point lies in the very name we give to this period. The term Middle Ages was not invented by those who lived in it. It was coined by 15th-century Italian humanists who needed a concept to designate what lay between the grandeur of ancient Rome and the supposed glory of their own time. The historian Flavio Biondo was one of the first to systematize this periodization. The purpose was not neutral. Creating an intermediate period of decline and darkness made the Renaissance shine brighter by contrast. The logic was simple and effective. The darker the past, the more luminous the present. And this narrative served its authors well for centuries. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries deepened the project. Philosophers such as Voltaire and other French thinkers constructed the idea that reason had been asleep for millennia under the weight of medieval superstition. Again, the darkness of the past was a rhetorical device in service of glorifying the present. And in that darkness, the medieval woman became a figure of total oppression and absolute silence. Not because the documents of the time said so, but because this image served the narrative they wanted to tell. What makes this process especially revealing is the era in which it reached its most sophisticated point, the 19th century. The Victorian period was, in many respects, the great producer of the image of the medieval woman as a fragile, dependent, and confined being. 19th century writers, painters, and historians created a version of the Middle Ages that said more about their own times than about the past they intended to portray. This is no small coincidence. The 19th century was, in turn, one of the most historically restrictive periods for women of the middle and upper classes in Europe. In Victorian England, a married woman could not own property in her own name until 1870. She could not vote. She had extremely limited access to higher education. The dominant feminine ideal was that of the woman devoted to the home, silent and absent from public affairs. It was historians, novelists, and artists trained in this context who produced the most enduring images of the medieval woman, and they produced them, inevitably, in the image and likeness of their own time. The medieval lady they described was, in essence, the Victorian lady in period costume. The historiographic recovery from this distortion is recent and still ongoing. It was primarily from the 20th century onward, with the emergence of feminist historical studies, that researchers began to return systematically to medieval primary sources with new questions. Eileen Power, a British historian from the early decades of the last century, was one of the pioneers. Her book, Medieval Women, rigorously demonstrated that the lives of medieval women were incomparably more varied and active than the dominant historiography acknowledged. Decades later, the American historian Joan Kelly posed a question that would become central to academic debates. Did women have a renaissance? The answer she defended, based on carefully assembled documentary evidence, was a challenging no. The period we celebrate as the dawn of modernity and intellectual freedom represented, for upper-class women, a narrowing of autonomy, not an expansion. The same centuries that produced Leonardo da Vinci and Niccolò Machiavelli also systematized the exclusion of women from universities, courts, and skilled trades. These discoveries have not reached classrooms with the speed they deserved, and there are reasons for this that go beyond simple academic inertia. Incorporating this view into teaching would require revising not only what we teach about the Middle Ages, but what we teach about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the very idea of historical progress. It would require admitting that the line between advancement and regression is far less linear than we have grown accustomed to imagining. What begins to emerge at the end of this journey through medieval documents is not just the history of the women who lived between the 5th and 15th centuries. It is the history of how we decide to remember the past, which stories we choose to tell, and, crucially, which stories we choose to ignore. And that final reflection leads us inevitably to the question with which we must conclude. What do we do with all of this now? The answer is not simple, and perhaps it is precisely this complexity that makes this history so necessary. What we have learned throughout this journey is not that the Middle Ages were a paradise of gender equality. They were not. Medieval women faced real restrictions, deep inequalities, and structures of power that, in many contexts, systematically disadvantaged them. Any attempt to romanticize this period would bring its own distortions and would poorly serve the historical truth we seek. What we have learned is something different, and in a way more unsettling. The narrative handed down to us about this period was not merely incomplete. It was, at crucial points, inverted. The degree of erasure we habitually attribute to the Middle Ages was, to a large extent, a construction of the centuries that followed. And that construction served, consciously or unconsciously, to justify the restrictions that those later eras imposed on the women of their own times. There is a methodological lesson in this discovery that goes far beyond the medieval period. It invites us to look with constructive suspicion at any historical narrative that presents the past as a monolithic block of darkness or light. Such blocks rarely exist in the reality of the documents. They are rhetorical constructions in service of something, and it is always worth asking in service of what and in service of whom. But there is also a more human lesson in this story. The women we have encountered throughout these chapters, the abbess who governed territories and received correspondence from popes, the merchant who appeared in court in her own name, the poetess who wrote about her own desire with a direct and unmistakable voice, the regent who held an entire kingdom in her hands for years, none of them defined themselves by what the system said about them. They acted within the possibilities they found, expanded those possibilities where they could, and left records that survived centuries of deliberate silence. Those records reached us only because someone, at some point, decided to look for them. Because historians chose to ask questions their predecessors did not ask. Because archives were reopened, documents were retranslated, contracts were reread with fresh attention. And because the idea that the questions we ask of the past determine the answers the past gives back to us was finally taken seriously as a methodological principle. There is something deeply revealing in the fact that the history explored here is at once very old and very new. Very old because its characters lived 8, 10, 12 centuries ago. Very new because its systematic recovery, its entry into history books, its arrival in classrooms, all of this is still underway. We are still learning to see what was always there. This means that history is not a closed archive. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, and the questions we choose to ask in that conversation matter. Each generation that returns to the sources with fresh eyes discovers layers that previous generations, constrained by method, interest, or prejudice, could not or would not see. And each such discovery reshapes not only what we know about the past, but what we believe to be possible in the present. The medieval millennium, with all its complexity and contradiction, was inhabited by women who did not wait for history to recognize them. They simply lived, acted, created, governed, wrote, traded, and resisted within the possibilities of their time and often beyond them. The recognition came later, slowly, when someone was curious enough to search for it and rigorous enough to document it. History, like any conversation truly worth having, is never really closed. If this narrative has awakened in you some curiosity about what else may be waiting to be discovered in the archives of the past, know that there is much more to come. In every episode of this channel, we dive into stories that time tried to erase and that historical research continues to recover with patience and precision. If you've made it this far, you already know that these stories matter. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any chapter of this conversation with the past. If this story surprised you, leave in the comments which moment or character caught your attention most. The answers often reveal stories even more fascinating than the ones we tell. And if you know someone who still believes that the Middle Ages were nothing but darkness and silence, share this video with them. Because sometimes the best answer to a myth is simply a good, true story.